Hi guys, today we are going to tackle a big topic, and that is the model view controller. Now, in the first module, when we talked about the anatomy of an app, we spoke about this concept briefly. But as we're building Quizlet and we're actually using a full model view controller design pattern in order to create this app, I thought this is a good time to address what exactly is the MVC design pattern and why is it useful and how are we using it in our app. So the first thing that we have to address is what exactly is a design pattern? Well, a design pattern is simply a proven solution or a best practice approach to a common problem. So to give a real-life example, a common problem that the early man might have faced is how do you stay warm when it gets dark and cold? Well, very early on, people learned that they could build shelters by taking animal hide and making it into a teepee. But then later on, they realized that actually animal hide is not all that fire retardant. And also, if you have some wild animals lurking around, it's not so difficult for them to come in and eat your family. So then there was an improvement on that design pattern, and people brought out mud huts, which were made out of mud so that the wind can't easily tear it down and animals find it hard to enter. But then people improved on that further, and we have the modern house, which is made out of wood, so it keeps you warm, it keeps you safe, and the majority of us will agree that this is a pretty good design pattern. So instead of having every human who needs to build a shelter go through the painful process of discovering what is the optimal structure to build as their shelter, in the process possibly losing their family to wild animals, instead we've come up with a design pattern or a blueprint that tells anyone who's looking to build a shelter what is the best practice for building a house. So any future house builders can refer to this blueprint and see that, oh, in order to build a house, I should structure it so that I have a foundation, I have walls made out of bricks, and also I should have a roof on top. And so this brings us to the model view controller design pattern. So this is something that came out of the research of Trygve Rienskan when he was working on Smalltalk at Xerox PARC. Don't worry, nobody can pronounce his name. It's Norwegian, and I'm probably messing it up horribly. But he came up with the model view controller design pattern. And this is a really good design pattern to use when you're building apps using object-oriented programming. And what this design pattern allows you to do is that if you have an incredibly complex app with many thousands lines of code, then you can structure it using the MVC design pattern instead of spaghetti code, which is basically a single file with loads and loads of code that interlink with each other and essentially just a whole mess to work with. Instead, you can implement a structure that will allow you to manage the complexity of your code. Let's first talk about the components that make up the MVC. So the M stands for model, which is a structure that manages the data. It's not the data itself, but it is responsible for creating new entries into the database or reading from the database or deleting entries from the database. So in that way, essentially, it structures the data and prepares it in a format that the view controller can use. Next is the view, and this is essentially just what you see on screen. And in the middle, there is the controller, and it handles communication between the model and the view. So say if you have a contacts app, and you're looking for a particular person's phone number. So you look up Amy's phone number, and that makes a request to the controller. The controller then takes this request and does some processing around it to see whether if this is an appropriate request. And if it is, then it sends a message to the model asking for that data. Now, the model is not the data itself. Instead, the model is like the storeroom manager. It grabs the data from the database and formats it in a structure that the controller can understand, and then serves that data back to the controller. And the controller prepares it for display on the view. So the MVC design pattern can be a little bit abstract. So to bring the message home, I'm going to illustrate this with an analogy. So welcome to our restaurant, and I'm going to show you how it works in this context. Now, in our restaurant analogy, the data will be the raw ingredients. The model will be the kitchen that prepares and structures the ingredients into dishes. And those dishes get passed over to the waiter, which is the controller in this case. And that waiter can take orders as well as serve orders onto the view, which is what the customer sees on the table. So first we'll start off by making a request to the controller or the waiter. We'll tell him that we want to see some pancakes on our table. Now the waiter is going to take that request to the kitchen. The chefs in the kitchen will then go to the larder and fetch the ingredients that are required to make these pancakes, or the data that's required to be served up. And then once the data is brought back to the kitchen, they will prepare the ingredients and turn it into something that the waiter can take back to the customer. And then the diligent waiter will take this dish and present it on the table of the customer. So if we have a look back in our code in Quizlet, you can see that the folders organize our code into the view controller model pattern. So our controller will be something like viewController.swift that controls what gets displayed on screen as well as what data requests to make. Now the controller can process those requests. For example, if you entered a password into a text field and it's 6 characters instead of 8 characters that's required, the controller will deal with that and say that, no, sorry, we can't take that input. And similarly, the waiter can say, no, we can't make a avocado frappuccino with mint on it. Then we've got something like question.swift, which prepares the data in a format that can be easily displayed on screen. And our question bank in this case is the actual data. It contains all of our questions. And so the question model prepares the question data and hands it back to the view controller. And the view controller then displays that data onto the view or onto the screen so that the user can see those questions being displayed and can interact with it. So why do we implement the MVC design pattern? What are the advantages? One, it provides a structure to your code. Once your code gets more and more complex, it can be really hard to get a grip on what exactly is happening where. Now, by splitting up your code into this model, view, controller pattern, you can find the relevant things in your code very easily. Additionally, it's a commonly used design pattern and easily recognized by other programmers. So if you bring a second programmer on board who's also going to work on your code, if your code is structured in an MVC design pattern, most programmers will recognize it instantly and be able to work on it without being confused as to how your code is organized. Thirdly, it allows for code reuse. So you'll notice that in the MVC design pattern, the model and the view never communicate with each other directly. As a customer, you can't just run into the kitchen and grab what you want and eat that, because it would be chaos. And the advantage of that is that you can easily change the data without affecting the rest of the code. So for example, if tomorrow I decided that my app was going to be in French, I could quite easily change my data file from the English questions to French questions, and I wouldn't need to change how any of the rest of my code works. So this allows for code reuse, and it is very efficient. And finally, it allows for multitasking. This is also related to how modular the code is. So for example, if you had 3 programmers working on the same project, you could do things 3 times faster by assigning one guy to take care of the view. So they're going to be the front-end designer. Then you've got one guy who's going to design the back-end. How do you want to manipulate, add, verify the data, etc. And then you've got the middle guy who can work on the view controller, determining when and how you present the data to the view. So it allows for many people to work on the same project. So there's a lot of virtues to implementing the MVC design pattern. And I know that a lot of beginner programmers don't like to implement it because it seems like it's more work. But once your code gets to a certain size, without having that structure, whether if it's using MVC or whether if it's using something else like MVVM, it will make your software much easier to maintain. So that's just a bit on the MVC design pattern. If you have any questions about it, feel free to leave a comment in the text box below. Otherwise, I'll see you on the next lesson.